Today we're talking with David Gadmer, who's a global expert in sovereign debt with over 20 years experience in the field. We spent the day at the Capital Markets Listers Association Annual Business Summit, where we've been discussing recent developments in SSA sovereign debt. And a lot of interesting themes have come out of today's discussion. Now, as you're aware, TEMPLARS works out of both Nigeria and Ghana. And obviously, we've been watching very keenly the events as they unfold in Ghana regarding their debt crisis, distress, and now, of course, they're in the debt restructuring phase. So very keen to hear your thoughts and views on really how they came to be in this position, how their debt restructuring is developing, and where you think they might end up.
So thank you very much, Zelda, and thank you very much, Chike, for having me. It was a pleasure. The day was very interesting, and we had very good conversations with all the people participating. So that's a very good question. Obviously, the sovereign debt space has been quite a subject for many months now, because we have seen a number of countries having the crises of different nature, but a lot of them being ingrained before, but that has been precipitated by the COVID event, and as well as the war between Ukraine and Russia, or rather Russia attacking Ukraine, but and the food crisis that came out of that. Now, Ghana's situation has been following that. It was not the first into obvious trouble straight away. It started with Ethiopia and Zambia, I would say, because case of Congo, for example, was much older, and so was Mozambique, and so came really as that tense environment. Investors started to realize that the path that the authorities had for them was not clear. And they started to question their basically ability to repay in the midterm, if you will, and started to say, well, I'm not so sure I want to lend to you. And that kind of, and we can discuss about the root causes after, but that kind of confidence crisis is something that tumbles events, because then the country that needs to continue on the path needs to refinance itself. And when you come to refinance and your capital provider says, well, wait a minute, not so sure I want to put that much money or, an equivalent amount of money into a situation, then you start having a problem. And obviously, when you have that problem, then you say, okay, how can I resolve it? Ghana chose, like others, to talk with the IMF, which they had many relationship with, and try to decipher a program which was addressing the overall situation in Ghana, which we have to recognize is a situation that is about their economy. And so it's not only external debt that is a problem, it was debt as a whole. Local debt that was way too high, and where basically all the new borrowing was just there to refinance the cost of that debt. So there was no value added of having that debt on the books. It was just increasing. And obviously, external debt with this, where when you have problems like that, start to have shortages into foreign currency. And so when you have shortages into foreign currency, it becomes difficult to repay, and you have to care for the first needs of the population. The root causes of that it's difficult to say, but maybe a bit too leniency into the authorities and hope into the future that can be always better. So you're not as careful, and then you continue to run saying, well, tomorrow will be better. So
optimistic.
Exactly, optimistic. So then it will solve the situation. And unfortunately, they were, the world has been hit by those different crises. And where you are on the edge, when a crisis comes, well, the precipice is right there. So precipice is a big word, but actually, I will see that myself more as an opportunity for any country, in particular here, Ghana, to reset a number of things and to start on a better direction. And that's what it is all about.
Because one would have thought that if you had local debts, that is local currency. And local currency, you would have thought that the government could print. So why is it the case that when we're talking about sovereign debt, we're not worrying not just about external foreign currency borrowing, we're also worried about local currency.
So let me start by saying that, first of all, I believe generally for any country, when they can, it's not necessarily all country that can, because you have to have a certain depth for a market, that local capital markets is very good. It's very important because that's a way where you have from your own economy an ability to finance itself. Okay. Now, you have different issues there. The first issue is that local markets attract also now foreign capital, okay, because the rates are higher than in the international markets. That's all fine if you have a fixed, a stable exchange rate. So they will have a view on the exchange rate, take a view, and overall they could be good. But if they sense that
there's volatility in the exchange rate,
they will try to flee away. So, and obviously they won't come in if you have too much restrictions. So, in developing the local markets, it's important to have them, but you have to maintain the right balance. So that's one angle where you have, let's say, potential risk in a local market. Now, the other angle is, the economy of the country. Sorry, my French coming out. So the economy of the country, where, if you have growth that is a little bit subdued, if you have also, because the way the economy is structured, you import inflation, and you have inflation on the rise. You have then higher rates. At some point, there's a level where basically what you can borrow or what you can print locally is just fueling inflation, for example.
So it's almost as if you're describing Nigeria when you say if you don't produce so much and you import a lot, and therefore you import inflation.
Yeah, yes.
So maybe Nigeria, maybe Ghana.
Well, Ghana for sure, and I'll come back to Nigeria, but to a point where basically the local debt and the local market to absorb was saying, even the local players, I need higher rates, right? And so the government would do that, but to a point where it was, compared to what their revenue, it so happened that we said a moment ago that the amount of debt that I was raising, continue to raise, was just barely enough to repay only my interest. So there was no capital investment into the country, into the economy, on the part that the government has to take care of. And it was just, rolling over. And so at that point, that's where it becomes, sustainable. But that's true for any local. When you look for in Europe or in the US, basically, when you have a currency of reference, it's a bit different. But when it's going to be the same mechanism. If you start borrowing into a Ponzi scheme whereby that borrowing is just to repay your interest, sooner or later, you will come to a level that just, it's not possible anymore.
And that's a very interesting point you're making about sustainable debt, because given what we've seen and what you're describing, which, like you said, will just be the case for Ghana and maybe Nigeria, the question then becomes, what lessons can countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, learn about accumulating sustainable debt or incurring sustainable debt?
Yeah, so...
Or shall we say unsustainable debt?
We'd rather it to be sustainable.
But see, so that's an interesting point, because I think we should think of the debt itself part as a result of an equation and let's say a balancing element rather than a root cause, right? And in fact, you should see that as a symptom. When you're sick, you're looking for symptoms, and then once you have the symptoms, then you try to decipher what are the root causes, to treat the root causes. And so, that's where, so part of the treatment could be to halve debt, right? But if you don't treat the other root causes of the economy, that won't work. And in fact, when you go see, let's assume we are the doctors, we go see the creditors and say, okay, let's cut, 50%. They will tell you, well, hold on a minute, because if I'm cutting 50%, what else are you doing so that it doesn't recover, right? It doesn't go back again. And at the beginning, where you let yourself a chance that you grow again, so that maybe the part that I cut, I can recover down in time in whatever format, because you've solved your problem, right?
So we're talking maybe public spending, waste, revenue.
All of that. So obviously, when you're talking about that, when you borrow, okay, the key is borrowing is a shifting of capital. you don't have necessarily the money now to do an investment. So you ask somebody to borrow because you believe and they believe that an investment will create wealth, cash flow that will enable you to repay that debt. Okay. And the particularity of governments vis-a-vis corporates is that you assume, let's say, the perennity through time of that entity, where a company can,
Yes, long time. Yeah,
exactly.
long time.
The company can actually die and
Perpetual succession.
Exactly.
And creditors of a sovereign cannot take over a sovereign, where like they can do in a company.
Yes.
So they are a little bit different dynamics, but the principle remains the same. So when you do that, indeed, revenue is key for a government. So is that, okay, what reforms, investment plan that I have, which will enable me, the economy to grow. And so as it grows, to have more revenue, basically sources. Obviously, the main one for a government is taxes, but there are many different forms of taxation. But for a country like Nigeria, you have other sources of revenue, which are direct or indirect, vis-a-vis the oil and gas, obviously, and the mining. But essentially, that's the investment that you make. So the key thing for sustainable debt is to have a view at a point in time. Now, let's say time T, where is my economy going? What I want to do and what I need for that, and how it matches. Now, once you have that in place, and so you can borrow sustainably, and that means maybe changing a number of things, a number of reforms. Then you can ask yourself, okay, what buffer do I take? Because tomorrow might be different, and there might be external factors or things that changes in my environment that I don't control. So what buffer do I take so that I can,
absorb those shocks,
absorb the shock? Now, there's no bulletproof 100% insurance because if not, we wish, but at the same time, it's like, if you don't take a risk to do something,
absolutely,
it doesn't work. Yeah, exactly. So in finance, we call that risk reward, but it's true in life. If we don't have, business people that thought of, businesses, I can do that. It serves a purpose economically. I'm going to build that and sell that services without, I don't know what people will be about to buy. Then, we would still have, basic economies, right? So is that taking a risk? And sometimes it happens. So, but when you are sovereign, you have really to, try to have these strong buffers to muddle through. It so happens that sometimes they are not as strong and you keep over the edge. And that's happened. But so when that happens, again, what I've been saying, it's not the end of the world. The idea is not to become, like some other countries, serial defaulters.
We wouldn't name them.
But when you say serial defaulters, it brings out the strangeness of this, because some serial defaulters continue to default, but they still find a way out.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a particular name we can name.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's
They
other.
continue to find capital,
Yeah.
actually,
Exactly.
to accumulate more debt that they need more help getting out of.
I mean, if you think about Argentina, if nobody else.
Well, I wasn't going to name them.
No, but you see, in these sentences, it always takes two to tango. Right? It's a beautiful dance, Argentine dance actually, but it always takes two to tango. So yes, you go through that, but the capital market at a large sense, and not only the bond market, but even the loan market, all the providers of capital, they have, and that's because also it's a human interaction. They have a short-term memory, and they're also driven by short-term goals, right? Because that's so I'm getting off track 1 second, but that's very important. When you consider the world of finance, and that's where very savvy people made a lot of money, you have to understand its structure, how it functions. Because since it's now, even though we have AI, it's automated, but it's still a human business, the way it's structured have some implication. And the one we just talked about is because you have people that have careers, 20 years, 30 years, and then even shorter in certain set. So there's a rollover of people, and they have short-term goals where I have money to manage. I need to make a certain, try to maximize my return over 1 year or over a period of a fund period, 2-3 years, 5 years maybe. And so then people change. And so as countries have a very long time, then you have periods where all things seem fine, and then capital start floating again.
Can I pick up on that and ask, right? Because a lot of what has happened in the sovereign debt space is attributed to the shocks of COVID-19, to the Ukraine-Russia war. But there's some suggestion, right, that some of these things predate those two massive events. And if I look at the markets, right, the point you're making, does it mean that sometimes the players overlook the risks because of short-term goals? Because some of these warning bells must have been there before.
That happens, and that happens even more. And so I'll come back to those points because they're important. That and that's a trend that changed, let's say, by the end of the first decade of the 2000s, where basically emerging markets saw really a pouring of capital market flows.
Yes.
And because they needed to grow, right? To invest in infrastructure, to invest. And so when you have that much pouring, and also from other official donors like providers of money, China, which has both official and commercial lending, all of that was because, you needed to grow. But as there's a big bunch that happens, some things can go wrong. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But so that was the trend. And indeed, when you have that pouring of capital, some people don't have the same vision. Some people, just follow markets because you have indices now. You just plug what I call blind pockets of capital that's just allocated on a more less structural analysis basis, but more on a market trend basis, right? Now, that is so. Each country is individual, has different problems, but you can summarize that in different factors. I would say a first layer of the envelope or the globe is the first basic structural missteps, right? Which is basically I borrow for, on political cycle because,
And we've seen that in at least one African country.
Or in more than one, unfortunately. But so to make the political cycle, so it's not necessarily well thought of or well planned. Then there is also the transitioning and the improvement of the management of governments in terms of who can borrow. Is it centralized, not centralized? Because when it's not centralized, well, it's not well organized maybe. And so you just end up sometimes, that's not well realized. Exactly. And then also how you create these buffers, not buffers, all that management, structural management plus the political cycle. So that's the number one envelope. Then the number two envelope is, how well your economy develops, right? And that's both internal factors and external factors, right? So in internal factors, you can have, factors that are bad because of
low production of your number one exports.
Factors like climate, for example, other factors where, you don't control the too much of black economy, and you don't, the government cannot get enough revenue off of that, the organization, some production problems that happen in the economy, in the economy of the country. Well, there's many different things we can go for if we are to list them all for hours. Then you have the external, because all economies are a strong base, and they should have a strong base, but they are interacting with the world, right? Big countries like so obviously US, but so China, which is a key thing for China, and other BRICS, but in Europe, they are based themselves from a very strong local economy, right? And that's why Europe United is to have the local market, right? And the US are that by nature. That's why China is trying to develop as much as they can their internal consumption and market, and not to just base their economy on exports for the US or Europe. Yeah. But yet we are interacting. Well, trade, we are interacting, and some things can come up here on competition, right? There's a new country that started a new thing, and it becomes a competition in one of your exports. There can be a shock of energy prices, for example, that renders your export not as good, or or increases the cost of your imports. And then they could be, so as we've seen, like diseases, and
Of course,
was
yes.
was one, or a war, a breakout of war, and it's so happened that you would think at the beginning, where it's Russia, Ukraine, or thing, what will really affect me? Yes, Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of cereals for the world.
Wheat, yes,
Exactly.
yes,
And
comes
so
out of
it
Ukraine.
obviously,
Yeah.
and especially for emerging markets. So all of that it does, and so that creates that other layers that even if you have your core layers all straightened out, it's never a very, as we say in French, a long fleuve tranquille, which is a long and nice river, that you go down. No, there's always some rough terrain right there, rough currents that you have to deal with.